All right, hello, my name is Catherine Weller. I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters of Utah, and I'd like to welcome you all to the first night, the public night of the League of Women Voters of Utah's annual convention. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan grassroots organization that has empowered voters and defended democracy for more than a century. We are open to voters of any gender throughout the state, and for more information, please visit our website, lwvutah.org. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from one of our own, and also so much more. Dr. Leah Murray of the Weber County League of Women Voters and Weber State University. First, I have a bit of housekeeping for us. Dr. Murray's presentation, Who Writes Our Laws? Model Legislation Outside Groups and Citizen Legislators, will be followed by a question and answer period. Please type your questions into the Q&A box found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will pose those questions to Dr. Murray. So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Murray and we'll get started. Leah Murray is the Brady Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Political Science and Philosophy at Weber State University. She was recognized as the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences Endowed Professor for 2017 to 2020. Murray currently serves as the Academic Director of the Walker Institute of Politics and Public Service, and in that role, co-chairs the Political Engagement Coalition with Teresa Martinez and advises the American Democracy Project team. Her primary research interests are in American politics, specifically youth engagement. Her recent publications are in the areas of civic engagement and technology and media coverage of the presidency. She teaches courses on all aspects of American politics. Murray received a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Syracuse University in 1996 and a Doctor of Philosophy in Political Science from the University of Albany in 2004. Dr. Murray, thank you so much for being willing to speak with us tonight. The League is interested, and I know citizens are interested in this whole concept of model legislation. So take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. I very much am looking forward to having this conversation with you all about model legislation. So I think what I'm going to do is talk about ALEC, okay? So, and the reason we're going to talk about ALEC is, quite frankly, no one else is doing this work in this way, in this space, if that makes sense, okay? So we'll kind of go after ALEC not as some kind of big bad, but really as the group that's doing this and is doing model legislation. We'll talk about what that means, what it entails, what it looks like, and then I think we'll end on why Utah is particularly vulnerable to model legislation. And by vulnerable, I mean they're more likely to use it than some other states, and I'll give you some reasons why to understand that. Okay, so let's talk about ALEC. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. And this definition here, the national policy organization that provides a constructive forum for state legislators and private sector leaders to discuss and exchange practical state level public policy issues, is from ALEC's website, right? So I have not, this is what they say they are, right? So this is not me defining them in their space. This is them defining themselves. ALEC was founded in 1973. So this is actually not a recent phenomenon. It is as old as I am. I was born in 1974. So ALEC has been around doing this work for 4 decades. And ALEC is founded by conservative, pro-business minded, political activists, if you will, in 1973 in response to what they felt was increasing Democratic Party policy encroachment, right? Okay, so they are responding to what is at that time in 1973, almost 4 decades of New Deal legislation, Great Society legislation out of the 1960s. And basically, there's an interesting way that they talk about it, where conservative thinker Milton Friedman said, you got to keep putting out conservative ideas. You got to keep putting out conservative policies. if we're going to beat back. And I really beat back with this Democratic kind of push that had been happening. So in 1973, they found, as a response to that Democratic, I don't know, kind of paradigm. Does that make sense? Like, the Democrats have been so successful for so long. So ALEC is reacting to that political space. And they design it in a really interesting way, right? So we can kind of talk about why the Republicans would have ALEC and not Democrats, is because the Republicans focused on state legislatures. So Democrats generally in their policy, and was true in 1973 and is still true today, looks to the national government to make policy and then implements it across the country. So the Democrats have not been as interested in state level policy making. Republicans, and this shouldn't surprise you, right? Republicans tend to be more state rights oriented. They tend to be more, you'll hear them say federalism matters, right? So that the states should be leading out. And so as a result, not, deliberately, but just as a result of that disposition, they're more focused on state legislatures. So what happens with ALEC is they go out starting in 1973 and build a community of practice of state legislators, right? So I'll put back up the definition. A national policy organization of state legislators, I should add that, that provides a constructive forum to discuss and exchange practical state level public policy issues. So that's their goal, right? Their goal is to talk to people at the state level, dealing with issues at the state level. ALEC is not secret, right? So you may have noticed if you follow any of our elected officials, ALEC listed Utah in the top like best places to be in the last week. And so Governor Cox and a number of our representatives were actually tweeting that out from ALEC. So they're not like a secretive organization. They're very public out in the political sphere. They, however, are very secretive in how they do things. So when we talk about ALEC, everything we're gleaning is from their public face. Does that make sense? Like what's on their website and what they're talking about and the documents they create. When journalists call them and ask them questions, they don't answer questions. When scholars try to track what they're doing, they don't respond. So they are very protective and jealous of their methods, right? So they're hard to understand in depth everything they do because they are behind closed doors making decisions. Okay, so it's a national policy organization operating in the public sphere, operating in the political sphere, but a little mysterious, right? So they keep their method of how they do things behind closed doors. Today, about 2,000 state legislators attend these meetings every year. So that's about a third of all state legislators in the country. So they attend a meeting, and what happens is they hold task forces. So ALEC will have task forces on a particular policy issue. And what's interesting about their policy issues, so this is something to note, most interest groups that we see operating have a policy issue that they care quite a bit about and they talk about it a lot. So kind of a famous example of that would be the National Rifle Association, and the NRA pretty much cares about gun rights and that's what they talk about. Or, you know, the ACLU pretty much cares about civil liberties and that's what they talk about. But ALEC is broad, right? So they're not picking a particular issue to talk about. They create task forces on issue areas that range from the environment to immigration to energy policy. I mean, like broad policy tent, if you will. So ALEC is looking at a lot of different types of policy. And what they do is they create task forces. So there'll be like the energy policy task force, or there is the environmental policy task force. And they get together and they talk about what would be a pro-business response to whatever that issue is. And those task forces write what we call model legislation. So model legislation, so when we answered the question, who writes our legislation, right? That was the title of this talk, who writes our laws? The task forces at ALEC will write legislation that represents a pro-corporate disposition. All right, so they kind of go, like, what would Google's response be to immigration, right? Like, or what would Microsoft want net neutrality ruling to be? And I remember the policies have to be state level, right? So they're not writing policy for the Congress to pass, they're writing policies for state legislators. So their priorities, kind of every 5 years, the task forces review every piece of model legislation that they have and check to see whether it still represents them and if it's still something that they want out in the world. So they're constantly, it's an iterative process, if that makes sense. So they're constantly looking at this model legislation. Every 5 years, they're reviewing it and they take a look at what's happening. So I want to give you a famous example of a piece of model legislation that you all have heard of, which is called Stand Your Ground. Stand Your Ground was a model legislation, criminal justice, right? So it's a criminal justice piece of legislation written that basically have states empowering individuals to defend themselves if they feel like they are in danger, and would have a defense, a legal defense, if in that process someone else gets harmed. This piece of legislation, the Stand Your Ground bill, received a lot of attention after the shooting of Trayvon Martin, which I'm sure you are all aware of that story. And like ALEC reacted, because when it gets a lot of attention, its ability to do its work is somewhat constrained. So that piece of legislation, the Stand Your Ground bill, came off of the ALEC website and hasn't been there since. So it had been something that throughout the 90s they were pushing. When the Trayvon Martin murder happened, they took it down. And then it's no longer something that they are talking about. So that's what they do annually, right? So they have this conference every year. 2,000 state legislators show up. They engage in these task forces, looking at policies, writing policies. And then what happens is that model legislation goes out to the state legislators by the state legislators who were at that conference. Note that unlike other interest groups, they do not work or operate in electoral politics. So it's not a PAC. They're not giving money to elected officials to try to win. They're not engaged in campaigning. You would not see an ALEC like ad, right? So you're not going to watch a campaign ad and have ALEC there spending money in that way. They work with people who are already in office. So they invite to their meeting state legislators and they talk about with state legislators, what are the big policy issues of the day? What is important that's happening at the state level? And what do we want to do, right? Like what we're going to write about it. So, and there's a question in the chat, is there anything similar on the left? So again, like I said, in the progressive space, not as much, because the left tend to use as a national government top-down method to its policy. So it's just kind of natural, because conservatives are more interested in state level policy. So what happens is the left doesn't really use this method. However, ALEC is good. They're really good at what they do. So what happens is if you are a lobbyist at the state legislative level, you are operating with legislators who are coming in with well-written pieces of legislation, and you're kind of like, where did you get that? And, you know, it's a pretty small world. So you figure out that this bill in Utah looks exactly the same as some other bill in Kentucky. You're trying to figure out like why that's happening. So the left lobbyists at the state level are aware of what's happening with ALEC, knows that ALEC is doing good. And what I mean by good is doing this well, right? Like getting their policies placed and authored and passed. And so the Democrats have something called State Innovation Exchange. And their logo, so ALEC, their logo is 6. So it's State Innovation Exchange. And they are trying to match ALEC on the progressive side. But ALEC has been doing this for a really long time, and 6 is more recent. So they're just not, how do I say, as good. And I don't mean good like, right, just they're not as powerful in this space as ALEC has been. All right, so let's take a look at ALEC. And so a question comes into the chat about ALEC with regard to birth control and voting restrictions. So let me kind of not speak that specifically, but let's kind of talk about more generally what happens with bills. All right, so let me remind you, it's very secret, right? So ALEC will never tell you what bills they're pushing, what model legislation they wrote. So in order to find it, what journalists and scholars have to do is go looking for, using like search engines, what is the language that we see, if that makes sense, right? So the research that we see on ALEC is relatively sporadic, although I've got one from 1995 and one from 2011, and they're finding the same thing. So ALEC is operating in this space, but I can't tell you how much influence they have on voting restrictions or birth control unless those things pop, if that makes sense, right? Because they're not talking about how they do things, right? All right, so let's take a look at how many model bills are introduced and enacted. So in 1995, a journalist goes looking at who is this ALEC and what are they doing and where are they operating? So what you see here is just literally the number of bills enacted in 1995 that were pieces of model legislation. So you'll notice Utah, if you can see, it's right up here on the top between Georgia and South Carolina. And Utah had about, it looks like 8 bills or 9 bills, I'm trying to see where that line lands, enacted in 1995. On this chart here, Virginia was a state that had the highest number of bills enacted that year. In 2011 to 2013, here we've got another bar chart. It's the number of bills that are introduced, not enacted. So it's a different way of looking at it. And in this one, this scholar, so the first one was a journalist. This one's a scholar from the Brookings Institution trying to figure out what ALEC is doing. And what they found in 2011 to 2013 was 132 model bills introduced in state legislatures. So what you would see is, and here you find Utah at the bottom, only 1 bill in this legislative cycle was introduced in Utah. And they're down here. You'll see West Virginia had 10 bills that they introduced in that legislative cycle. And what's interesting is, so I told you that mostly this is Republican, but of these 132 model bills that were introduced in these states, 90% of them were introduced by Republicans, but actually 10% by Democrats. So it's not, like, it's a conservative organization, but they're not exclusive, right? So if there is a Democrat who sees a piece of model legislation coming out of ALEC that addresses some issue that the Democrat in that state cares about, we actually see that happen, right? So the Democrats will use the model legislation as well. So of these bills that get introduced this year, 90% by Republicans, 10% by Democrats. Here's another piece of information, right? 2/3 of these bills, so 67% of them, were actually introduced in the lower chamber. So one thing we learn is that state legislatures and legislators, the ones that are using ALEC, generally are in the lower chamber. So if we think about Utah, they're going to be in the House, not in the Senate, right? So it's going to be the lower chamber of the legislature where these bills are being introduced. 57% of the legislators who introduced these bills were explicitly connected to ALEC. So they were one of the 2,000 people who showed up at that conference and got an idea for the bill. Now, this is introduction. So it's like how many bills get written and actually get introduced. 9% of ALEC model bills passed in this election cycle. Or excuse me, in this legislative cycle, which might not seem like a big deal, except that Congress's passage rate is 2%. So 9% is actually really good, right? So if you can get 9% of your bills passed, you are doing a pretty good job. Now, to answer Angelina's question, but not well, okay? So when we look at this data, what this shows you are the subject of the model bills. So you will notice here, we don't see voting restrictions, or excuse me, we see democracy, voter rights, and federal power. In 2011, like I don't want to look backward with the lens of the voting bills being passed as, you know, around the 2020 election and what's going on right now, right? I think probably it's got to do with voting and making voting harder, but I want to be careful to say I don't know that it's like on the line of voting restriction the way that we are seeing in Georgia or in Florida right now. But so these are the areas, the policy diversity that we see here. So schools and higher education, taxes and budgets, worker and consumer rights, special education policy, there's some voting rights, tort reform, health, pharmaceuticals, guns, crime, immigration, prison, environmental policy, and then immigration by itself, right? So we don't see here that any kind of Planned Parenthood, does that make sense? Or any kind of abortion laws being in this election cycle. So I can't speak to exactly whether birth control is being influenced by them. The top bills in the 11-13 cycle were, so when we're thinking about immigration, ALEC pushed a no sanctuary cities bill, and 23 states saw those bills introduced. They had a fracking bill, so it was a disclosure of hydraulic fracturing fluid composition, and that bill showed up in 10 states. By the way, so exactly the same bill, right? So it's model legislation, which means ALEC writes the fracking bill and then you find it in the 10 states in the exact same language being introduced. They had 9 states with the stand your ground bill that I talked about before, that ALEC has since distanced itself from as a result of the Trayvon Martin murder. Then we've got state withdrawal from regional climate change that showed up in 9 states, and firearm regulations showing up in another 9 states. So again, they are corporate leaning, right? So what they're thinking about is what bills are good for what businesses, but that diversity of policy topic, does that make sense? Like they are just all over the policy map, introducing legislation. So again, it is centralized because 2,000 legislators go to a conference, have a conversation about, you know, what's going to happen around a particular policy. And then they go out and they introduce the exact same piece of legislation in all of our different states, right? So we see them across the board. Okay, so again, ALEC doesn't report how they do. ALEC doesn't tell us like how well they're doing. ALEC doesn't tell if they win in the way that some other interest groups will kind of tell us what we're doing. But I want to talk about states, and this answers Norma's question about whether we see more ALEC sponsored bills in Utah. So let's kind of like go after this, not that specifically, but I think it helps answer your question more generally. So this is the map of the United States, and I grabbed this from the National Conference on State Legislatures. And so it came in a little bit fuzzy. So let me just tell you what the colors are so you can kind of know what it is that we're looking here. The more green the state is, the more professional the state legislature is. The more gold the state is, the less professional the state legislature is. So when we're looking at this map, what you will see is Utah is yellow. It's not orange, right? So the orange states are actually the least professional in the country. So the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Montana have the least professional state legislatures. Utah's among 10 states in the country, and notice they're across the country, right? So it's not like that regional, that have what we call part-time legislatures. So part-time legislatures are defined as being under-resourced. Okay, so the Utah State Legislature goes into office and serves for 45 days, right? So they're there from like January to March, and it's a mad dash. And then they all go off and do something else for a living. You can also refer to these as a per diem legislature, in that most of their life they're doing some other job. So how we define a professional legislature, so the states here that are green, these are people who make more they make their living being a state legislator. So a professional legislature looks like Congress. So if you think about the United States Congress, our Congress member up here in Congressional District 1, you know, he gets paid $175,000 a year to be a Congress member. He gets health care through Congress. Like, that's his job, right? So his full-time job is that. So professional legislatures, when our legislators go, and that's the job that they have. The part-time legislatures are ones where this is their, you know, side hustle, right? So they've got some other job that they do that actually pays the bills, that they take care of their families with, and the legislature they do on the side. All right. All the gray states here that are not showing up as a bright color are what we call hybrid legislatures. Hybrid legislatures are when the legislators spend more than 2/3 of their time doing their legislative job. So it's not part-time, right? It's not a side hustle. But in the gray states, these hybrid legislators, they would not be able to make a living doing that job. So what happens in the gray and the yellow and the orange states, the legislators have to be either independently wealthy, right? Because they're not going to be able to make a living being a legislator. In the green states, they are full-time. All right, so in the green states, not only are they full-time, so these are people who this is their job, like what they do for a living is be a state legislator. They actually also have staff. So the green states provide resources to their legislators. So they have people who they pay, who have a job, who have healthcare, who actually show up every day to research bills. Okay, so what happens, right? So Norma, this kind of goes after your question a little bit. What happens in a yellow state like Utah is there's nobody doing research on bills, right? So they show up in January. Let me totally take that back. Of course there are. The Walker Institute sends interns to the state legislature. So I know that I had 6 students who were doing research on legislation, but they're interns, right? Like, they are not full-time professional staff. And their startup is the first week of January. They learn everything they need to know. And then they're in a mad dash for those 6 weeks with the legislator at the same time, but they're students, right? Like, they're not full-time staff. So what happens is the yellow states and the gray states and the orange states do not have people who are doing research on legislation. They do not have money to run a survey, right? And the number of times I can tell you that our legislators have like asked interns, can you like call some people and ask them what they think? Like, so, but in the green states, they have a lot more resources. So they have staff that actually is going to do some research. They're going to have staff that helps them figure out what legislation is. So you're Utah, you are a state legislator, you're going to do it for 6 weeks, and then you're going to go be your real estate agent or whatever else you're going to do. And ALEC is going to invite you to come to a conference and give you a piece of legislation that addresses some issue that your constituency cares about. So what happens is in these states where we don't have a lot of resources, these legislators rely on ALEC to help them write well-vetted, well-researched legislation because they don't have people to do that for them. So what happens is we see in these states the situation that they are under-resourced, and so ALEC kind of steps into that gap. So the first one was, I was talking to you about whether they can live and have a full-time job. This table here shows you, what percentage of their life they're doing it, right? So Utah, our legislators spend about half of their time on the job. They get paid a per diem. They don't have an annual salary. And then the total staff of the legislature, the average is about 160 people. So they don't have a lot of support. And so as a result, they need model legislation because they do not have the ability to write legislation. All right, so let's take a look at what we see. And again, we've got data on the 1995 bills, and we've got data on the 2011 bills, and the data was the same 20 years apart.
So the way that ALEC works, we didn't see much difference across those 2 decades. So what this chart shows us is something interesting. The x-axis here is committee leadership role, and the y-axis is predicted ALEC bill share of all sponsored bills. All right, so Stuart Adams, right, is a leader. I would expect him not to use model legislation as much as other legislators in the state of Utah. But he likes ALEC, it's a conservative organization, and he probably would encourage all of his junior members to attend. Does that make sense? So I think it's possible that we would get more ALEC sponsored bills introduced this year with that tight connection between our leadership and their leadership. However, I wouldn't think that Stuart Adams would be using ALEC bills as much, because what happens is that if I am a leader, even in a state that's a gold state that doesn't have a lot of resources, I'm usually writing my own bills. Leadership is staffed better, even in our unprofessional legislatures. And so as a result, they tend to use ALEC less. So if you are a junior member of a state legislature, you are more likely to use model legislation. You have no idea how to write a bill, like you've never done that before. I have a former student who was a first-time legislator this year. He wrote 3 bills, none of them did very well. He was like, I had to find a rule and a fiscal note. He had no idea because he was brand new and he had like 5 minutes to figure it all out. He'll attend an ALEC session. He'll get a sense of what a bill should be. He'll know that it's well vetted, and he'll know that there'll be support. And members would like to tell their constituents that they passed legislation, right? So what happens is our members are interested in looking at these bills as a result of needing some help, right? So figuring that out. But if you are a committee leader, you're going to have more resources, you're going to get some more help, and you are going to be less vulnerable to using ALEC model legislation. So the more resources you have, the less likely you are to use an ALEC legislation. What this chart here shows you, and so this is just data analysis of what causes ALEC bills to be enacted in state legislatures. And generally the takeaways here, this is a regression analysis of what's going on with these bills. The more resources you have, the less ALEC is effective. The more business oriented you are, the more ALEC is effective. The more liberal you are, the less ALEC is effective. The more professional you are, the less ALEC is effective. The more productivity is hard. So what that lagged legislative productivity means is like how efficient I can be, right? How good I am at doing this. The more I'm going to use ALEC because I'm going to try to be more productive. The more unemployment in your state, the less likely you're going to use ALEC. The more you have a budget deficit, the more likely you are to use ALEC. The more your citizens are favorable toward big business, the more likely you are to use ALEC. So I want you to note, right, like states have dispositions. So Utah might be introducing more ALEC-sponsored bills, not because of Stuart Adams, right? But because Utah is a pretty pro-business state, a pretty conservative state, and a pretty unprofessional legislature, right? So there's kind of other reasons why ALEC would be playing a role. When we look at authorship, right? So this is looking at legislators and seeing whether they are sponsoring bills with regard to using the ALEC model legislation. The more conservative you are, the more you're going to use ALEC bills. The more Republican, the more you're going to use ALEC bills. But this is where it gets kind of interesting. The more you are a committee leader, even if you are conservative, the less likely you are to use ALEC because you have the resources. You've probably been in office for a while. You know what you're doing. You have a sense of where the constituents are. The startup cost is not that hard, and you're able to write your own legislation. So it's interesting. It's not perfectly conservative Republicans are doing it. because I would argue Ann Milner probably is not using ALEC as much, right? So it's, you could be a conservative Republican, but if you're a leader and you've been there for a little bit of a while, you're not going to be using ALEC at bills as often. So Utah is vulnerable to ALEC because they are conservative, because they are pro-business, and because they are under-resourced, right? So Utah legislators are likely to use ALEC model legislation. And then the problem is, and this is a normative conversation, the question is whether it is a good idea to have model legislation when we think that our representation at the state level should be more local, right? So when we think about how we define representation, what we're thinking about is, I want Ann Milner, who's local, right, to write something that's a local bill. I want, you know, I want it to be about Ogden, or I want it to be about Salt Lake, or I want it to be about, right, like what we have going on here. What's interesting about ALEC, I think what it does indicate is how national some of our issues have become, right? So to a certain extent, if you are an organization that since 1973 can plop in pieces of legislation that are written at a national conference and people don't really notice, so like to find out, to see it, you've got to actually do some snooping, got to really investigate to find the legislation, would be an indicator that probably we don't have state policy issues as much, right? That many of these issue areas, from immigration to energy to criminal justice issues, are more national. And so ALEC is successful because our country's policy positioning is becoming much more national. So that's what I have. I can answer any questions about ALEC more generally, or more specifically, just put them in the chat or in the Q&A.
Thanks, Dr. Murray. While we're waiting to see if any more questions arise, and thank you for asking while we've got them, somebody emailed me a question in advance, and that person wanted to know what ALEC's funding mechanism is.
Oh, yeah, okay. So this one looks very much like any interest group you would see. They collect dues from corporations. Okay, and they have been connected, like I said, Google, Microsoft, the Koch brothers. I mean, like, they are connected with all of the major corporate players that you could think of. Does that make sense? But the difference is, rather than being a PAC, so the money doesn't come in and then go out to a campaign to run an ad, the money comes in so that legislators can come eat lunch and dinner together, right? Travel, they give scholarships to the legislators. The legislators don't pay to attend ALEC. So the money comes in to support the conference and the working of the task force, but you generate dues and revenue from those dues, just like you would see from any other interest group, if that makes sense. So what happened with the, so this question came in. With the Stand Your Ground bill, when the Trayvon Martin case happened, Google, Microsoft, they pulled back, right? Because they were like, now ALEC is out there, everyone's paying attention to them, and the last thing we need to do is be connected with that really controversial issue. And so they pulled out. But we haven't really thought about ALEC since Trayvon Martin. Does that make sense? Like, they're not public, they're not as controversial. They're very private about who their revenue sources are. Right, we only knew Google was in it when they left, right? So they were announcing that they were leaving. And the reason why they're very private and can get away with it, it's not campaign finance. So there are no rules about, right? They don't have to disclose who they get money from because they're not doing campaigning. So they're not subject to campaign finance rules. So as a result, we know money's coming in, we know it's big corporations, we know the names of some of them, but we don't have a list, right? Because the list that they have is very private and behind closed doors.
All right, thank you. And we've had a few more questions drop into the box. There is a question about ALEC's secrecy, and if they're so secretive, how can the average person recognize one of their pieces of model legislation?
Yeah, you can't, right? So, right, no. So, and again, there is an organization tracking it. So there are people very interested in campaign finance and money in politics, right? So if this is something that you care about, it's unfair to call it campaign finance because technically they're not funding campaigns, right? Like they are working in a different, interesting space. But it's a worrisome, right? Like, so if it is the case that the Koch brothers are writing legislation, right, that's going across the country, and I'm there as an average citizen, and I don't have, all I have is my vote, right? Like I'm not funding an ALEC conference. There is some concern for representation, right? Like who are state legislators actually representing? And yeah, ALEC Exposed is the organization, so they track those bills. So in the same way that you would have to, kind of really dig, Open Secrets is another one. So Open Secrets does campaign finance, like, so you could find like who funds Blake Moore. Does that make sense? Or who funds Mike Lee? So you can find those. So there are organizations that track it, but an average citizen would have to know, A, that ALEC existed, right? Because I think most ordinary citizens just assume the legislators do the work. Right? So you got to know this is happening. And then you'd have to go find an organization that's tracking it. It'd be very difficult to do. The data that I shared with you, 20 years apart, when you read the Brookings Institution, they're like, the amount of work it took to find, and that's someone who's being paid to go find ALEC. Does that make sense? So an average citizen would have kind of a hard time tracking that.
I'm going to just ask you a question here because when you were talking about the funding mechanism and the corporations that do fund them, the question that came to my mind when you were talking about ALEC developing this policy and model legislation was, how do they decide what large corporations want? What's the process that informs those decisions?
Right. So it's those task forces. So they literally every year, I imagine it's like the nerdiest political Comic-Con, right? So like all of them show up and they get input from their dues paying members, right? So they're kind of like, what are we thinking about? What do we care about? And then they assign groups to look deep dives. Does that make sense? So it's like, this is the task force on energy policy. And that year, fracking was the thing, right? So that task force was looking at it and saying, fracking should be allowed. So we need legislation in states to allow it. How can we protect it? And then they write legislation based on that. But the Trayvon Martin story reveals that they also track to see, is something controversial that's going to shed light on what we're doing. They work best in secret, right? So what happened with the Trayvon Martin case was when the Stand Your Ground bill became clear and showed the whole country that an ALEC organization existed and that everyone had that model legislation, they dropped that bill, right? So they would have, and so that decision process would have been, they won't talk about it, right? No one will tell you this, but clearly their decision-making process was, this is giving us too much bad press, and so we pulled out. If that makes sense.
Those funders are on the task forces in the rooms. It's not just legislators that are meeting, it's the funders of
That's right.
ALEC itself.
Yep.
All right. Leah, Nikki Nelson is asking, how big is ALEC, as in how many actual people? She wants to know about its management structure and who started it.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I was actually thinking what I'm going to throw in the chat is the link to their like about page on their website. So you could click on it and look at it. So like I said, it gets started in 1973 by corporations, the Koch brothers, K-O-C-H, those brothers who we often hear about in campaign finance are a core part of ALEC. But it's dynamic. Does that make sense? So there are different people moving in and out of this space. And also I should say, like we've been talking about state legislators, but kind of like any organization, like Ted Cruz would show up and give a talk. Does that make sense? So even though he's not a state legislator, he's a conservative. So sometimes you'll see other Republican elected officials or like the rock stars of the Conservative Party are also connected to it as well. But the page that I put in there has that structure, and has like who they represent, who their staff are, who their leadership is, if that makes sense. So yeah, and thank you for putting in the ALEC exposed. Yeah.
We owe that to Kathy Bealey. I just moved that over from the Q&A side.
Perfect.
There is a comment from Nikki Nelson also that sometimes legislators say their bills come from ALEC.
Yeah, so if you're in Utah, like I just said, right, Governor Cox was tweeting, ALEC says we're the blah, 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 right? So it's, right. So ALEC is not necessarily a problem for Utah legislators, right? So again, why? Because the people here are conservative. The people here generally are pro-business, right? Does that, right? So it's not something that would be a problem, but maybe would be more of a problem in a more purple state. Does that make sense? Or more by, you know, like a state where it's not a one party dominant. But if you're in a Republican state like Utah, being with ALEC or running an ALEC model bill is not necessarily a problem. Because think about how complicated that is. You'd have to say, they're running a bill that someone else wrote. And I'm going to have to pause and be like, so who's representing me? Right? The 2 to 3 steps of thinking of an average citizen. So I think in Utah, it's not as controversial as it might be other places. And definitely less controversial now because there hasn't been Trayvon Martin. Does that make sense? So there's not a bill that became nationally focused on that made ALEC a bad name. Does that mean you're like, whereas about a decade ago, that was a problem, right? So ALEC was like, we've got to distance ourselves from that stand your ground legislation.
Okay, and Carrie Dabney asks if you're familiar with ALEC's work on transferring U.S. public lands to the states.
I'm familiar with it to the extent that yes, like this would absolutely be an area of interest for them, right? So 1, because it's a conservative positioning, 2, because it's states' rights. So ALEC would be having conversations about, you know, providing legislators with the resources they need to figure out how to fight the federal government. Does that make sense? So they are going to author legislation to help states like Utah have that battle.
And do religious organizations and PACs attend and influence ALEC bills?
Not necessarily, right? So let's kind of be clear. All the organizations that are in the ALEC sphere are also probably in PACs doing campaign finance, right? But ALEC is not an electoral politics organization. So it is not trying to get, right? Like, so it doesn't say, hey, right? Ann Milner is really good and we're going to give her some money for her campaign. What it does is says, here, Senator Milner, here's a bill. So it's a very different resource that it's providing, if that makes sense, right? So it's operating in a little bit of a different way.
All right, and let's see, boy, they're popping in here, Dr. Bell. What is the cost of ALEC membership dues, and what are the qualifications to be a member?
So the members are the state legislators. So what the qualification is to be an elected official at the state level, unless you're, so then it's the corporations who pay dues to support it, the same way that you might like fund a foundation. And the answer is, I think that's one of the secret parts. Does that make sense? So yeah, so they've got their filing with the IRS. It is a nonprofit. They are not required to disclose. So I think someone knows that answer, Stuart Adams maybe, but I don't. Right? So it would be people are inside. And like I said, when journalists call, they don't answer the questions. So, but it's possible ALEC Exposed knows. Does that make sense? So they might, the link that Catherine, you shared here, might that answer might be there if we dig on that site.
Mm-hmm. There is the question if we know which bills that passed in the last few years in Utah came from ALEC. Is that where we go back to ALEC Exposed?
Yeah, that's what I would do. Yeah. So again, ALEC doesn't claim them, right? And so unless, and I'm picking on people and I apologize. So so unless Ann Milner, and I'm just picking on her, I'm like, unless she said, this is an ALEC bill, we wouldn't necessarily know because ALEC doesn't list its model legislation, right? Because it is effective if people don't know what they're doing. So they list their issues that they care about, like public lands, but they don't list how effective does that, you're like, they don't list, here's a bill and we got it in New Mexico, or here's the bill, right? You can only really find it if you go looking for that. So I don't know that I know that answer specifically for the last couple of years.
And there's a wonderful question in the Q&A box. What thoughts do you have about how citizens can act to present a counterpoint to the voice ALEC gives to corporate interests? Example, in a way of driving interests of consumers and employees in terms of changing tax code, minimum wage, et cetera. And can this happen at the state level?
So yeah, this is a really good question. So my answer to this is, it is very difficult. So how do I say this? So in the same way that the state legislators are under-resourced, right? So they're vulnerable to ALEC legislation, model legislation. Citizens are under-resourced, right? So it is hard to know what are corporate interests pushing, right? So the answer is citizens have to present a counter to what ALEC is offering, and how citizens get their representatives to listen to them is to email, to call, all the things that we do. When we interview Utah state legislators, it's interesting, like they will say, we're not going to respond if it looks like a spam email. So one of the things I've seen is people will say, click this and it will send an email for you. And the legislators they're hip, they got it. And they're not going to listen to those. So they're looking for individual citizens to write things. If you do that, they will listen to you. Does that make sense? But it is really hard to have enough citizens to counter, you know what I'm saying, Shauna? Like, it's hard to have enough citizens responding to, something that they're already disposed to agree with, right? So ALEC is giving them conservative legislation. They already kind of agree with it. I think one of the better ways to go after it, and I think like the League of Women Voters could go after this too, is to talk about representation, right? Like, is who, why? It's someone else writing your legislation for you. And I'm questioning that, right? And maybe the concept of that presents a counterpoint. But it's hard. And you're right, they are very corporate friendly. And they are very good, right? So they are deeply embedded at the state level, and there really is not a counter voice to that. And the answer really is because corporations are well-resourced and normal citizens are not, right? So as a result, like that kind of mismatch and the balance in the conversation happens all the time writ large, and ALEC just exacerbates what we're seeing there.
Dr. Bell, Carrie asks if you know if ALEC has any association with the National Center for Constitutional Studies.
I don't know that answer. That's a very specific answer. So I'm looking real quick on the website that I shared with you. Like, they care quite a bit about their interpretation of the Constitution, right? Which is very much a federalism matters a lot and state rights matters a lot. And so they kind of land on that. So one of their tabs on their website is federalism. So they are talking about, the 10th Amendment, the reserved powers to the states, like they push that a lot, but I'm not sure how connected they are to the National Center for Constitutional Studies.
And for those of us who are uninitiated, would you tell us what the National Center for Constitutional Studies is and why that's significant?
Oh, I don't know. So for me, it's the place where I get my pocket constitutions, but I'm not sure why Carrie thought that was significant. Does that make sense? I'm not sure why.
Yeah, so Carrie, if you drop that in the chat box, that would be great. We'd love to see a little more about there.
Yeah, because like I said, I use that, like that's how I get, they've got those pocket constitutions. You might have gotten one at some event, right? So I use them and they do grants for work with youth engagement, but I'm not sure why that might be significant, if that makes sense. So there might be something else there that I just am not aware of.
All right. And Vicki asks if ALEC gets involved in drawing legislative maps.
That's a really good question. I would imagine they are, so the answer is no. Like, so let's be like really specifically, because they're not lobbying, right? So redistricting is vulnerable to lobbyists. And by the way, you should watch redistricting across the country over the next year is going to be just fun to watch. And it's vulnerable to lobbying, but ALEC doesn't lobby. Does that make sense? So ALEC would have written legislation, I would imagine, to protect state legislatures from commissions. Right? Okay, so when we did the initiative a couple of years ago to get the better boundaries, like the fair, right, what we have now is a commission that's going to look at redistricting, ALEC would have probably been engaged in trying to write legislation to stop that from happening, but they're not going to be lobbying for lines. They don't care who's in office. They'll just bring you and give you lunch and then you'll do their bill, right? Like, so it's a little less, like I said, it's not electoral. It's more, once you're in, they're wooing you.
Mm-hmm. And do you have a sense if ALEC cares about adding states to the union? I'm thinking DC or Puerto Rico, perhaps, if they are pro-states' rights.
So I would imagine that their answer, because remember they are conservative, but let's be fair. Let's think about it. I think that, so when I look again, when you look at like their issues and what they're caring about, DC, Puerto Rico doesn't pop. Does that make sense? Like that's not something you see on their website. They are conservative, so they're talking about it. But the national questions are really not interesting to them, right? So ALEC's going to be like, I don't care how many senators there are, or whether you add 2 states that adds 4 Democrats to the United States Senate, because my power is at the state level, if that makes sense, right? So I don't want to say that the people who are involved have an interest politically, but ALEC as an organization might be agnostic as to that issue, because for them, right, it's a little less relevant because they care about the state legislatures, not so much what's happening in Congress.
Right. So we are coming right up on 7:30. This has been fascinating. I have one little question to ask you. The ALEC's National Conference is in Salt Lake City at the end of July. Are you going?
Do I look like no? Oh, but yeah, no. But that's interesting. So what I probably would do is go hang out at lunch. Like, see if you could be like at a restaurant somewhere and see if you can see the power. Not that I like, but it's interesting when you kind of are just kind of aware of who all is in that space. Yeah. Will the League of Women Voters be there?
We will not. We're not members, so like you, we probably can't get in the door.
They would not let us in. Exactly.
But we are nonpartisan and we're all about transparency, so we're comfortable in that role.
Yeah, no, and ALEC presents, and that might be another conceptual issue, right? So I brought up representation, but what you just said there with transparency, it presents a complication on that as well. Because if the answer is, I don't really know who's funding it, like most of our federal campaign finance rules are about transparency, right? So it's about knowing where's the money coming from, where is it going, which is supposed to enable a regular citizen to kind of make a more informed choice. When you have money coming into a nonprofit that's not subject to FEC regulation, transparency is hard to get, right? So you could kind of go after ALEC with that particular concept as well. And I hadn't thought of it, but yeah, that principle matters here too.
I think that's why a lot of us are very interested in model legislation in general, is that whole issue of transparency.
Yeah, and again, when you're reading like who's studying ALEC, like every single one's like, it's very secretive. I called, they didn't answer. Like it's hard. Does that make sense? So ALEC Exposed, it's investigative journalism. Do you know what I mean? Like, and it is someone whose job it is to track this because it's hard to see. So it's like not transparent at all.
Well, Dr. Murray, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. I can't think of a better way to kick off a state convention in which we'll be talking about what activities we'll be doing in the next year to ensure things like voters' rights and transparency in government. So thank you so much again for joining us, and league members, I look forward to seeing you all. Vicki and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, bright and early at 9 a.m. for the State Leagues Convention. Thank you very much and have a good night.